Goodness knows that we've had some marathon sessions here. Hopefully tonight won't be one of them. But we are here to conduct the people's business. So I'll call the meeting to order, and I'll read the appeal statement. Pursuant to the provisions of the Metropolitan Code of Laws, please take notice that decisions of the Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County Community Oversight Board may be appealed to the Chancery Court of Davidson County for review under a common writ of a common judicial writ. Any appeal must be filed within 60 days after entry of a final decision by the board. Any person or the entity considering an appeal should consult with an attorney to ensure that time and procedural requirements are met. With that, I'll turn to Mr. Secretary Goddard and ask if we have a quorum. Do we have a quorum?
We do. Yes.
Okay, we do have a quorum. All right, you received the minutes from the previous meeting. You've had an opportunity to review them. However, if you would like to take a moment to review them. Is there any unreadiness? Hearing none. Can I have a motion, please, to adopt the minutes as presented?
So moved.
It's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded that we adopt the minutes from the previous meeting as presented. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Now is the time for public comment, and if there are members of the community who wish to speak before this board, now is the time. All members of the community who wish to come before this board will have a limit of 3 minutes to make their remarks. Keeping in mind that public comment is not subject to vote or to debate. Are there any members of the community that wish to come before this board? Hearing none, we'll close public comment. I joined this board to serve at the pleasure of the 134,000 Nashvillians who voted to amend the home rule charter of this great metropolis to establish an independent community oversight board endowed with the constitutional authority to investigate allegations of police misconduct brought by the tax-paying citizens of this county. Now we are engaged in a historic legislative civil war brought on by petty politics and misguided aims. Tomorrow, not far from here, in the halls of the capital of this great state, a bill will continue to wind its way through the House and Senate committees that would abolish the home rule charter vote of the taxpayers of Nashville and Davidson County that created this independent board. This board, created in ascension with the rising souls of Jaquez Clemens and Daniel Hamburg. This board, which has on countless occasions worked hand in hand with the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department to improve policies and restore the public's trust. This board, which has demonstrated a non-biased support for the brave men and women of our police force who have demonstrated their commitment to do the right thing. To the citizens of Davidson County, please know that this probable unconstitutional act pending in the state legislature is being perpetuated not only by those outside of our city, but also by some whose salaries are paid by your tax dollars, as well as those who have garnered your vote and sworn to vigorously represent you as a constituency. To take away the investigative powers of the COB, to no longer allow community-based organizations to nominate members, to take away the authority to interview witnesses, and to turn all citizens' complaints over to the Internal Affairs Division of the Police Department for investigation would turn back the hands of times in this city to a time once again where we will have the police investigating the police. This pending legislation, Senate Bill 0591 and House Bill 0764, are advancing through the Senate Subcommittee on State and Local Government, sponsored by Senator Mark Pody, District 17, and through the Criminal Justice Subcommittee, sponsored by Representative Elaine Davis, District 18. To think that all the hard work, dedication, and trust that has been realized since the Charter Amendment of 2018 may be swept away as a part of revenge politics, as a part of petty revenge politics. That would be more than a travesty of justice, but also a moral failing of the greatest significance of the people we entrusted to look after our best interests. We must contact our legislators now and let them know that we are willing to fight for our sovereign right to be fairly representative. Of all the elements of this legislative civil war, shrinking Metro Council, diluting the powers of the Sports Authority, dismantling the Beer Board, defunding the Music City Center, these revenge-based politics should not be allowed to destroy the voted home rule and the will of the people that established this board. Should it become law, I, for one, will not be a part of betraying the intent of the people. Next item on the agenda for discussion, we're going to skip that first bullet and go to the MOU committee update. Board Member Goddard, our subcommittee chair.
Yes, we have a meeting scheduled a week from today, next Monday afternoon, with the police department to hopefully either wrap up or come close to wrapping up the MOU discussions. It is complicated by the bill you just spoke so eloquently about, in that one of the big issues for discussion left is what documents the board is able to get from the police department, how quickly those are obtained, recognizing more large document requests or maybe a need for rolling response, stuff like that. But a lot of the documents this board would be able to receive would be greatly restricted if that legislation passes. So that's a cloud over the meeting, but the police department, to my mind, to its credit, is willing to go ahead and meet and have those discussions. They've not pushed for a delay to wait and see what happens on the bill.
Excellent, and I trust that there's any types of conferring, meet and confer that you need to have with this board, you'll let us know.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Board Member Goddard. That moves us to the legislative update, and I'm going to turn that over to Director Joe Fitcher. All right, Assistant Director Kylie, would you like to take that item, or shall we move to the next item? And all right. Well, let's come to the business of the people. Under proposed resolution reports, we will start with CC 2022-016. Assistant Director Kylie, are you prepared to present that, or shall we also wait?
There we go. Can you hear me now?
And while you're getting yourself squared away there, I'd like to take the time and opportunity to welcome the ever-present Commander Laura. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, so this is report CC 2022-016. The complainant filed a complaint stating that on the afternoon of April 21st, 2022, at about 12:50 p.m., an employee with Metro Nashville Police Department walked into a storefront where the complainant worked and asked the complainant to remove a sign from the sidewalk. The officer left and returned a few minutes later yelling that the complainant needed to move the sign. It was further alleged that Officer 1 yelled, quote, "Why haven't you moved that yet? You guys are not doing what I told you to do." Officer 1 stated he would return with a ticket since the complainant's manager refused to comply with the request. About 45 minutes later, officer returned to the store for a third time and yelled for the second time. In terms of this, we looked at potential policy violations for conduct unbecoming, discourtesy, adherence to policy and rules, and activation of body cam. In terms of the findings of fact, we interviewed the complainant who works at a downtown business on Broadway, who related the facts that I just read, that the officer entered the store, ordered them to remove an A-frame sign from the sidewalk, and that when the officer returned and the sign was still there, the allegation was that the officer yelled at the employees. His body cam was not activated for the first two of those encounters. The officer left after the second encounter and said that he would return to issue a ticket for the sign. His body cam was activated while the officer was standing outside the business writing the ticket. A review of the body-worn camera showed the officer entering the business where the complainant and manager work at about 1:45 p.m. The initial conversation was not recorded due to the 1-minute delay in audio recording. During their conversation, the officer said to the manager, quote, "So you guys are refusing to move it off the sidewalk. Would you like the owner to be here to sign the citation, or how do you want to do this?" The manager nodded his head in the affirmative, and the officer replied, "Okay, y'all are more welcome to give him a call." The employees at that point did call the store owner, who was on his way to the store and eventually did arrive. The officer spent about 7 minutes completing the citation paperwork and re-entered the business at about 1:53, at which point he asked, "Is he," meaning the manager, "on his way, or is someone else going to sign it?" At that point, there was a lengthy back and forth between the two. And just to summarize that, the employee was basically saying that he had been ordered to put the sign out on the sidewalk, that he felt he would be fired if he did as the officer commanded, and they were sort of going back and forth about that. During that time in the body cam, it was observed the officer repeatedly raising his voice, in contrast to the employee whose voice was pretty flat. Eventually, the manager requested that the officer step outside to continue the conversation, and they did so, and the officer and the store manager on the sidewalk continued to have a disagreement. The manager advised the officer that he felt he was being unprofessional and confrontational. Eventually, the officer called his supervisor, and at 2:07, that sergeant arrived and talked to the manager. During that, the manager explained, quote, "I feel like I'm fighting a battle that isn't my battle. And the reason I got upset about it is the way I was approached earlier, with the officer coming into the store, raising your voice in front of customers. And the customers were asking me, why is he yelling?" End quote. And the discussion and analysis section, after reviewing the body cam and the testimony from the officer and the employee, it seemed that the officer's instructions to the manager to either sign the citation or move the sign off of the sidewalk appeared to escalate the situation unnecessarily. Ultimately, no citation was issued for the sign, but when the sergeant arrived, he told the manager that if the manager refused to sign, then they would write refusal to sign in lieu of a signature. So the basis of our findings was essentially that the officer was observed raising his voice at the manager more than once, even after the manager asked the officer to lower his voice in the presence of multiple customers. The manager described his interaction with the officer, that he felt like he was being beat up on and in danger of being arrested. And at one point, he was observed physically backing away from the officer while the officer's voice was very elevated. In this instance, the officer acknowledged visiting several businesses prior to visiting the one under review, as well as having interactions with the manager prior to turning his body cam on, but those were not able to be observed. And so we had, I'm trying to find the finding in here, Jill. Here we go. The offense category for conduct unbecoming varies by the severity of the violation. Here, based on the repeat instances of the officer raising his voice and the presence of other members of the public, the executive director recommends a category D offense, a first offense, which is generally disciplined between 1 and 4 days suspension. And here, the executive director recommends a 2-day suspension. Discourtesy is a category F offense, a first offense of which is generally disciplined with formal counseling or an oral reprimand. Here, the executive director recommends formal counseling. And the third category of policy was adherence to rules, which is generally a category D offense, a first offense of which is generally disciplined between 1 and 4 days. Here, the executive director recommends a 2-day suspension.
Discussion on the executive director's recommendation on the item in general. I see Board Member Goddard.
One question first. The copy I have for the category D had a 4-day suspension recommended. Was that changed, or was that?
That's a good question.
For the very category D offense?
Yes.
Yeah, we did change that. Maybe I this updated. Which copy? Oh, you must have sent down the. Did everyone else's copy have it 4 days?
Yeah.
Yeah, I changed that before it was, we changed that.
Okay, so with that modification,
It's a 2-day suspension for a category D, for that particular. And then for the discourtesy, which is a category F offense, it is a formal counseling. And then for the body worn cameras, which was also a category D, I gave a 2-day suspension.
And those would be consecutive or concurrent?
Sorry, they're always read consecutive. They
That's
don't
what I
have
thought,
a
just being,
concurrent.
all right, I've got, and I apologize for being mouthy again. I've got several concerns here. One has to do, and it relates to some other PRRs with I would recommend we have some consistency on first offense, not turning on the body worn camera. And, let me back up. One thing I want to say, I read, as usual for me, the reports. One question I had going in that doesn't really answer anything, but was relevant, I thought, is why is this guy making such a big deal of having a sign on the street? And the answer is that was an enforcement priority. It's Lower Broad. They've got all these signs. There's an ordinance or something that says no signs on the streets in that part of town. So that was an enforcement priority that had been communicated to him, is my understanding. If I you said, okay. So that's out there. Last time or time before, I've forgotten which, we had an extended discussion about a first offense for not turning on a camera when the officer self-reported. And that was a big mitigating factor. And we wound up, we discussed no consequence, and we discussed the lightest possible consequence, and wound up with the lightest possible. And I think that's fine, and the issues we've got today are not on self-reports that I know of. It strikes me for a first offense of not turning on the body-worn camera, that a 2-day suspension is pretty severe. And the other concern I have is the investigative report did not have any questions about why the camera wasn't turned on. If it wasn't turned on, it is concluded the camera wasn't turned on because we can't find the video. And that probably he didn't turn it on, but the officer wasn't even asked why he turned it on, if he misunderstood the policy. If he turned it on, he doesn't know why, any of that. That came later in reviewing and more senior staff noting that he hadn't turned it on. We need a consequence for that. And I've got some, for lack of a better phrase, due process concerns about coming up with a consequence as significant as a 2-day suspension when the officer was not asked about that or given a chance to explain his side of the story, if he has one. The other thing I've got to suggest is category F and D in this case sort of overrelate. I think category F is employees shall be courteous, civil, and respectful to all persons. Clearly, this officer was not. That specific violation is a category F. Then we've got this general, you violated any rules, and a much more significant range of sanctions. And it seems to me we're sort of to my mind, taking what better fits a category F and calling it conduct unbecoming and greatly increasing the penalty. I'm not going to make a motion yet. I want to hear more discussion, please. But I would take that first one as a category F and have a lesser consequence for the failure to turn on the body-worn camera. First offense. Feel very differently about a second or third offense. Thank you.
I'd like to respond to that. Like, we don't know if that's the first offense. I mean, we know it based on the complainant and the complainant putting it, from what the complainant said and what we saw on the body worn camera. I would not be in support of changing it. I think that the bottom line is this officer met with this person multiple times in and out of that business, knowing that they were meeting with the public, and did not turn their body worn camera on multiple times. It was in and out of the store at least 3 times. And so my concern is that this officer and all officers know what the body worn camera policy is. And so they have had that policy in place for over almost 3 years now. And so I would just say that I believe that that's a fair, I think it's a fair, I wouldn't say punishment, but a fair process. We looked over it, and I changed it from a 4-day to a 2-day based on all the information that we had.
Changed it when? The first paragraph I saw was a 2-day.
Right, you said that you had a 4-day.
No, that was on the disrespectful. The body worn camera was 2, first draft. But yeah, I still got the due process concerns.
Board Member Holloway. Please turn on, yeah.
What is his background? What is his history? Has he been in trouble before? And also, what did the department recommend? Have they recommended anything at this point?
His prior history was extensive, which was part of the reason that we did that. This is an officer, and I don't want to give identifying information, but has been employed for almost 10 years with the department and has had a number of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or so disciplinary violations over those years. Some of those fell out of the the retention period, so we didn't factor those in strictly, but his disciplinary history is extensive.
And has the police department made any kind of recommendation on this incident?
This case, when I contacted OPA, this case was not referred to them by the complainant. She only contacted us, so I do not believe they have taken any action, but I can't speak to if something was done at the precinct level or so on. This case had been investigated when I got here, but when I contacted OPA, they didn't have any knowledge of it, so I don't think anything's happened in the department.
Is there any reason why that history didn't appear in this report, or was it all out of tenure?
I'm not sure which ones are in the report. I know that, I just closed that. I mean, these are 2014, 2017,
Okay,
17, 17, 19, so they're mostly older.
okay.
And then he had 2 in 2020.
What page is that on?
What you have is on page 7.
Page 7.
7, under recommended action.
Gotcha, okay. All right, I was used to seeing it in a separate, okay, I got you. Okay. Never rolled into that. I see Board Member Goddard.
I have and this is more for going forward, but it relates to this. I have a real problem with having factors, be they mitigating or aggravating, considered when coming up with what are we going to charge an officer with, what are we going to punish, and that not being in the report specifically, in the specifics of that, and that not being able to be considered by this board. Can you read all of those that affected your judgment in coming up with this recommended sanction?
I'm sorry,
Read the specifics of.
of what the charges were?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I want to be clear, I didn't come up with those disciplinary recommendations.
I want to be clear as well. I believe that Board Member Goddard is referring back to the non-admission or not having the opportunity to explain. Is that it? Why the body-worn camera
These are
was not turned on?
No, these are compounding. What I think I heard was that the disciplinary history was extensive, and that's what led to a higher level of consequence for this officer. And that's a separate due process consideration than asking the officer about the body-worn cameras. I'm not opposed to having all manner of prior bad acts considered by this board. I have a real concern with it being recommended to us and that being part of the judgment of the staff and us not having that information in front of us to consider as well. I may well agree with it completely. I have not prejudged that. I just don't like not knowing.
I think the board has to take in consideration only that which is contained in the report and making its own independent judgment about whether or not the recommended discipline is appropriate or not.
Well, if that's the case, I feel pretty strongly that it's overstated because I don't have any of that to consider.
And it's my thinking that otherwise, there's no sense in it, there being a statute of limitations on the discipline, right? I mean, there's a statute of limitations on the discipline for a reason. right? And so if it falls outside the statute of limitation, I don't see how and why, how we could consider it. I see Attorney Yoon.
I think it's a little backwards. There was several violations, two of which are within the retention period. They were category Cs. I want to say third offenses. And we could, yeah, so third offenses, so this is a category D offense. Technically would be a third offense, which could be disciplined between 5 and 10 days. We went outside that range because the two C categories were traffic-related offenses, sort of, they call it miscarriage of government property, where there was some sort of traffic, I don't know, you hit the pylon or in a garage. I think the other one was an actual bumper with another bumper. So it didn't seem relevant. That being said, I don't believe when they do the disciplinary process that they don't discount those like we did. We decided this would be treated as a first offense, D, category D, even though I think if sustained by the department as a category D, they're going to move it to a third offense. The aggravating factors that we did consider and mitigating factors were the fact that the body worn camera was shut off during a time that was an allegation of misconduct that occurred. I don't believe in the prior instance that was referenced that the body worn camera being turned off or on, we felt was substantive in any way as to the allegation of misconduct that brought him to our radar and where we investigated. The prior instance of misconduct was, I think, either not sustained or unfounded. But during the course of our investigation, we noticed that, the body worn camera had been turned off. We, I think, didn't recommend any disciplinary action initially, but the board considered it and decided to sustain it and move, or no, I think we did actually. We did recommend some discipline with regard to the body worn camera, but I think the board actually increased the discipline in the prior instance. In this instance, we felt that the aggravating factors were that it actually did pertain to an allegation of misconduct. Had that body worn camera been turned on, it may have tended to prove or disprove what the complainant was alleging. We also noted the presence of multiple members of the public who observed and were sort of affected by, we felt, the misconduct by the officer. And third, the actual sort of behavior and sort of fear displayed by the complainant. This wasn't just a discourtesy and unprofessional conduct. It seemed to also be intimidating and concerning for his personal safety when the officer made the statement about either one of these two things is going to happen, and the gentleman actually sort of backed away. And I want to say that we might have even put the statement in about, I'm not attacking you, or so that was all sort of the aggravating factors that led to a 4-day recommendation that was later amended to a 2-day recommendation, but a cumulative disciplinary recommendation of 4 days. Hopefully that's helpful.
Okay. Board Member Nguyen.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. I noticed you interviewed the sergeant in this complaint. Does that sound right? Officer Sergeant? Okay. Because I want to ask about that, but what's more concerning to me is, did the complainant say that the officer placed him in fear? Did he say that? Or are we assuming that from him actually physically backing away from the officer?
I don't think he ever said that he was placed in fear, but what he said was he felt that he was being put in what was a very unfair position, because he was basically either move the sign against his boss's wishes and possibly lose his job, or sign a criminal citation for the sign, which he stated to the officer numerous times, I didn't put this here, I don't think I should be signing it. So he didn't say fear in the sense, but on the video, it's pretty clear that when the officer's voice kind of jumps in tone and the gentleman steps back, significantly. He steps back 5-10 feet from the guy. So, and his hands are up. So he didn't really categorize it as a fear thing, but he did categorize it he characterized it as sort of like, am I being criminally charged? I don't understand this process. He asked at one point if he was going to be prosecuted. So I think the fear would be more as to that kind of the fear of the legal action than, I don't think there's any fear of physical force. It was more just discomfort, I think would be a fair way to.
Okay. So the sergeant, when you interviewed him, did he explain why the citation wasn't issued?
Yes, pretty clearly. He relayed the information that the order to clear these signs came from precinct commander. And the sergeant expressed that basically he felt like this enforcement action was maybe overzealous and inappropriate. So he did not think a citation needed to be issued. So when he arrived on the scene, he, essentially gets in between the store owner when he arrives and the subject officer of the complaint and diffuses the situation. But so he kind of takes the citation and I think eventually just ripped it up and told them to treat the interaction as a warning.
He ripped up a numbered citation?
He didn't rip it. He explained what the process was for closing out a citation, but it
voided
was
the
not
citation.
issued. Correct. Correct.
The sergeant made a decision to void the officer's citation.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I see, Board Member Brown.
Out of curiosity, did the sign ever get moved? I mean, one of the concerns I've got is there's a serious problem on Lower Broadway with pedestrians and signs and everything else. And if the sign's in violation, I'm a little bit concerned, particularly if it wasn't moved. Once the owner got there, if they didn't move it, it's a violation. And I mean, the manager may have been a little bit between a rock and a hard place, but he had the manager on the phone, and apparently the manager, I gather, ordered him not to take it in. So I'm sort of curious why the sergeant would void a ticket if the precinct commander had said this is a priority. So that's a little bit of a different issue, but I don't think the officer, I think, was trying to enforce what's a problem there. And, somebody trips over a sign or steps out in traffic or something and gets hurt, Metro is going to end up maybe with liability for not enforcing a sign. So I think the officers hadn't raised his voice, although I'm not sure how you don't raise your voice in one of those honky-tonks to be heard. I'll take your word that he raised his voice more than necessary, but the other thing, it does seem that the two violations, which had originally a 4 and a 2 day, seem to overlap. I would be more inclined to combine those and with a 2 day suspension. I do think we need to do something about the body cameras, and for a first offense, we need to have something there. I think it would have been better had the officer been specifically asked about the camera, and I gather that wasn't. But I would be more inclined for a 2 or at most a 3 day suspension for combining those violations.
Board Member Holloway.
If the body camera had been on, it would have cleared up a whole lot of things, would answer a whole lot of questions. And at this point in time, you must take some kind of action about the body camera not being taken on. So whatever action you take towards that will be justified.
Understood. Further discussion? Board Member Witzel.
I just have a question. Is that question about why the body camera wasn't turned on, is that something that is typically asked in the investigation and just wasn't this particular time?
I think it would just depend. I think in this case, one thing I wanted to say that I don't think is in the report is that the officer described speaking with a number of store owners before this one, and that also went to our assessment of not having it on, was that he had, if I remember correctly, he said he'd spoken with something like 30 store owners that morning. And so if our thinking was if you are sent out by your commander to go speak with that many members of the public in sort of a mass enforcement action, that it seems egregious to not have it activated. But your other question, could you just restate that so I could?
I was just asking, is that typically a part, like in investigations where body cameras weren't turned on, is that like a standard question that is typically asked to the subject?
I think it should be.
Yeah.
Especially where we have one that's going off in the middle of an interaction. It's one thing if they don't activate it, in the course of their running around, or there's some, exigent thing happening and they forget to do it. But this was one where it just seemed strange. But yeah, I think it definitely should have been asked.
But at the same time, we're not here to rewrite the SOPs of MNPD. I mean,
Right.
They have an individual responsibility as described under their procedures. Whether it's because something externally caused it to happen, not happen, or if it was a conscious or not by design choice of the officer. I mean, we can't really get into all of that, in terms of making sure that we're stating the policy and responding to the policy that's in place. I guess we could spend a lot of time trying to figure out why, and I think that's important, but at the end of the day, the body camera was not turned on. I am very much so kind of in line with the idea that we want to make our recommendation consistent with whatever precedent we have already established for that type of offense. Very much in line with that. But I don't think that this body should get into the whys, wherefores, and how comes of a violation that is clearly already defined as far as responsibility by the department. Did I see? Okay. All right. Board member.
All right. I think if my memory serves me correct, we were here a couple of weeks ago and there was an issue with a police officer who self-directed or said that I forgot to turn my body camera on, and he essentially admitted that he forgot. We don't have all the facts here, but what we do know is that a significant amount of money was spent for officers to have body-worn cameras and for them to utilize them, right? And so this is what we do know. We are human, and some people forget things. If they are talking, police officers are no different. But I will say this. If they had been working Broadway from early morning and this is what they were doing, right? This was his assignment. He was tasked to do that. And then as the situation escalated, right? I would think rationally that some thought of a body-worn camera and turning that camera on would have crossed his mind. Now, we don't know, but because we only have what's in front of us, but if that is the case, then, and it wasn't in here that he stated that he didn't, he forgot to turn it on or something happened in the middle of that, then we have to, go by, he didn't utilize his body-worn camera. And so if we do want to set some type of, action for not turning on your body-worn camera, and it is just across the board, then we probably need to think about that. But as far as the director's recommendation of a 2-day suspension, I think if we're not using body-worn cameras, then they need to take them off, right? Or we need to try to find some kind of policy recommendation if we're going to use the body-worn cameras, and then how will they be enforced? So we could have potentially cleared up a lot of this kind of back and forth. It looks like the situation was escalated by the officer, especially if he told the manager to call the owner of the establishment. And then once the owner wasn't coming fast enough, then he kind of moved the goalpost. So we really have to decide on, since the camera wasn't on, the argument or the interaction escalated, what does this actually look like? And what does this mean for, if we're talking about conduct unbecoming and, really making sure that if we wanted all the facts, we probably could have had all the facts, but we don't have proof because the camera was not activated.
Thank you, Board Member Haddock. I'd like to ask Board Member Goddard, who took the time and opportunity to review the material, and I assume that would included the body-worn camera footage.
I read the investigative report,
Okay.
which usually runs, I don't know, 7, 8 more pages,
Okay.
single-spaced, and it has summaries of the
All
body-worn
right.
camera. I did
Okay.
not go
All right.
to the
All right.
effort. I want to be real clear on
Yeah,
that. But it is the staff's full report is,
Okay, so, but there's no question about the discourteousness. Is that right? Even with the written,
agree, absolutely.
right? Okay. Because, writing, it sounds intense, but to actually hear it, which the investigators have done, and we certainly know that you have done your due diligence, that's more than just trying to scream over the honky-tonk saloon noise.
Yes, we reviewed the footage numerous times, and I should add too that where this took place inside, this was in the afternoon, it was inside of the boot store, so when we talk about the honky-tonk noise, it really was not a loud environment. It was just inside of the store, and so the raising of the voice in the context there was no need to yell over anything else, that's all.
I defer to staff on that, and that's consistent with what's in the report as well. No issue there.
Board Member Nguyen.
Yeah, just real quick as a point of reference, the Metro years ago, just want to let you know, we had a thing in patrol cars, and Walter used to operate them, and I did too. They were called an iron sergeant. And it was a device that the officers could not tinker with, but was directly connected to the mechanisms of the patrol car to tell whether you were speeding, your motor had stopped, or your blue lights were on, and all the electronics were on. And each shift, you had a round graph like this paddle, and you placed it in the machine, you locked it in, and it marked your graph. At the end of the shift, you gave it to your sergeant. And if there were complaints in the public about speeding, you get in trouble. Well, that device was used for years and years and years and years. Everybody had, if you were a patrol officer, you had to have one. But there were officers who would forget to put their graph in the machine at the top of the shift. Sometimes we'd say, okay, that's an accident. But after a while, we would realize that we had some habitual offenders, lead foots, if you would. And then we had to suspend them. We had to correct them. I don't know how long it will take, because we're talking about humans, to get into the habit of turning the camera on. It may take a while for most. There may be some who don't. But, you'd like to think that, if you get discipline from this, the word gets around. If you turn the camera on, you're going to get in hot water. But that's not a guarantee. And it wasn't a guarantee when we had the iron sergeants, and I don't think it's a guarantee when we got body cameras. So it's just something to consider for the future. Thank you.
Board Member Holloway.
Just one last comment on that. What the officers got to realize, that camera can save their job. Just like you talk about the graph, prove that where you're moving or how fast you're going. If somebody complained that you was going too fast, all they had to do is look at the graphs, and it will verify exactly what you're doing. So these type of things can save your job in the long run. So if by chance you continue to be a police officer on this force, this is the future. This is what we're going to be doing. And we just cannot accept the fact that we forgot. It need to be clear that this is the process, and this is what we're going to be dealing with.
Okay. All right, having had a fairly robust discussion, is there a recommendation on the executive director's report and recommendation? Is there a motion?
I will move, get things started for a 1-day suspension to run consecutively for each of the two offenses. The first day on the disrespect being between an F and a D, and the 1 day suspension is a significant thing for an officer on the body worn camera. I think that's enough to send a message, 2 days total,
All right, did you say consecutively or concurrent?
consecutive.
Consecutively. There's a motion. Is there a second?
I second that motion.
Okay, it has been moved and seconded that the board return a recommendation or a modification
Modification, yes.
to the report for a 1 day suspension on each charge to run consecutively. Now is the time for discussion on that motion. Board member had it.
All right. So on each offense, are we saying 1 day suspension on each one?
My motion was the first two be combined as a single 1 day.
Okay.
I didn't make that clear, thank you.
Further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion carries. All right, Director Fisher, next report.
Point of clarification.
Point of clarification, Director
So
Fisher.
when you say combine the discourtesy and conduct unbecoming, I'm a little confused, I guess, on how to draft that modification, because it's two different offenses. I get what you're saying, but do you just want, well, I'll just ask, how do you envision combining discourtesy and the separate offense of conduct unbecoming?
I would suggest that the discourtesy is a lesser included in conduct unbecoming, that it's 1 day for conduct unbecoming, and the specific conduct includes discourtesy. Does that work?
When I read the misconduct policy codes, I want to say conduct unbecoming is actually a more general, and discourtesy is actually a named offense. But conduct unbecoming is,
As that item has already been disposed of by the board, and I think that what we're talking about here is logistically how we have that work. I would recommend that staff, give, board member Goddard or individually any other board member that may need to provide clarification,
I'm happy to do that.
a call to figure that out.
thank you.
You're welcome. All right, that takes us to the next item. While you're adjusting yourself, I just couldn't help but to believe, but to say that, the idea of policing sidewalk signs being in the hands of law enforcement, for me is a little bit out of at least my experience. When I was a budget analyst in the Public Works Department, on my first day, Stan Scholl sent me down to Swenson Ice Cream to go pick up a sign that was in the middle of the street, of the sidewalk. I didn't go in and consult anyone. I snatched the sign and brought it back to Stan, and he had it in his office at the head of his desk for the next 12 years. Okay, I'm sorry. So anyway, yes, it may have been, a little overzealous enforcement or even policy there. I don't know. Sorry for that divergence, Director Fisher. I relived it. I was there again. I'm scared. I don't know what.
This is MNCO complaint CC 2022-043. The allegations of misconduct against Officer 1 are deficient performance of duties, adherence to rules for the failure to provide medical attention. Number 3, adherence to rules for body-worn camera deactivation. Against Officer 2, it's deficient performance of duties, and then adherence to rules, the failure to provide medical attention. The complaint allegations are on August 13th, 2022. The complainant filed a complaint with the Metro Nashville Community Oversight stating that on August 12th, 2022, the complainant's girlfriend was the victim of a hit and run on the corner of 17th and Church Avenue. The complainant alleged that 2 MMPD officers arrived, Officer 1 and Officer 2, and they left the injured victim in the street and did not provide medical attention. So on August 12th, 2022, at approximately 10:50 PM, the complainant's girlfriend was struck by an unknown motorist at the corner of 17th Avenue and Church, making her the victim of an alleged hit and run. The complainant was not himself present when the accident occurred. He arrived some minutes later after the police had arrived and the victim was being placed in the ambulance. The victim was a pedestrian at the time that she was struck. The victim stated that she was waiting at a crosswalk when an unknown motorist sped up and struck her on the left side of her body, and that she made contact with the front driver's side of the vehicle, fell to the ground. After being struck, she was assisted to the sidewalk, whereupon she sat with her hands on her head, waiting for emergency responders to arrive. According to the victim and other witnesses, there was blood across the victim's chest, bleeding from her head, and ripped clothing. She stated that she was lightheaded, felt like she was going in and out of consciousness, felt like she was going to pass out and maybe throw up. Officer 1 stated when she arrived, it was dark, she could not see well. Officer 1 stated she did not see any apparent injuries or anything that required bandaging. Officer 2 stated upon his arrival, he observed cuts and bruises to the victim. According to both officers, the complainant was already seated on the sidewalk when they arrived. And the victim stated she felt like Officer 1 and 2 could have assisted her better, but they were more concerned about cleaning their paperwork, and she stated that they were making jokes. The complainant alleged that the two officers spent about 5 to 10 minutes asking questions about the hit and run, standing around and talking prior to giving her medical attention. We asked for the body-worn camera of Officer 1, and then MMPD Records responded with a 3-minute video of Officer 1 in the car prior to exiting the vehicle. Officer 1 acknowledged being present and is clearly seen in the video of Officer 2's camera. So a second body-worn camera video request was made, but the records reported that the 3-minute video was the only one that they had from Officer 1. So Officer 1 did not have an additional body-worn camera as she was interacting with the victim. During the interview, Officer 1 reported that upon her arrival, the victim was on the curb, was alert and talking. Officer 2 stated that when he showed up, he looked up and saw cuts and bruises on her. He requested an ambulance over the radio, and Officer 1 was sitting with her. Officer 2's body-worn camera shows Officer 2 being approached by an unidentified pedestrian at about 10:50 p.m., reporting that someone had been hit by a car. Officer 2 drove briefly, arrived at the intersection where the incident occurred, which was about 1 minute later. Officer 2 exited his patrol car. He immediately asked, "Is everybody okay?" When Officer 1 arrived, Officer 2 stepped away from the victim and asked Officer 1 to talk to the victim. Officer 1 talked to the victim. Officer 2 stepped a couple paces away, and that's like a minute later. Then Officer 2 radioed for an ambulance. Officer 2 reapproached the victim. Officer 1 and the witnesses gathered around. From Officer 2's body camera, Officer 1's interaction with the victim is not audible. What is observed is Officer 1 standing over the victim, taking pictures with her phone of the intersection and talking with other witnesses as well as the victim during the next several minutes until other medical personnel arrived. Officer 1, during her interview, acknowledged asking other witnesses if the victim had been drinking. Officer 2 asked a crowd of witnesses, did anybody see it? What kind of vehicle was it? And then for the next couple of minutes, they continued to ask follow-up questions, from several witnesses. Officer 1 stated she asked the victim questions, her name, date of birth, address, to ensure that the victim was talking. Officer 1 believed that she asked if the victim had any injuries, but her questions of the victim are not captured on the body-worn camera. At 10:57, the victim's friend is on the phone and says they're here. Upon Officer 2 reapproached the victim to say an ambulance is coming. And then, of course, at 10:59, the fire department, an official arrived, and Officer 2 told the fire department that the victim was hit by a car, possibly had a head injury. And then a fire truck arrived at 11, and ambulance arrived at 11:03 and departed with the victim. In this matter, it appears that Officer 2 radioed for medical personnel immediately and within a minute of his arrival. Officer 1's video is not available to demonstrate what she did and did not do to provide care and first aid to the victim. But the allegations by the victim and witnesses are that neither officer provided any medical attention for 5 to 10 minutes. And then we also, of course, see that the ambulance arrives at about 10:59 and they provide the medical attention to the victim. Officer One's statement to the MNCO was, I just asked the victim questions to make sure she was still talking, like what's your name, where are you from, your date of birth, stuff like that. I think I asked her if she was bleeding anywhere else. Did she feel pain somewhere? Just make sure that she was still alert and she was responding to the questions. So basically, it didn't appear there was any violation of MMPD policy in regards to a couple of things. So I'll read this to you. Let's see. Officer 2 stated that he did a visual assessment of the victim and asked how she felt. He observed scrapes and bruises, but did not appear as though she had any broken bones or arterial bleeds. So basically what we saw was that Officer 2 responded, made the questions made the calls for the ambulance to show up to get the medical attention. Both of the officers was trying to get information on the vehicle that hit the young woman and drove off. And there was, I think, a communication problem between Officer 1 and Officer 2 as they related talking to the victim. The victim also had friends there who she was talking to. She was alert, although she felt, as she says, that she was feeling somewhat sick because, of course, she was hit and fell to the ground. What I will say is that when we requested the body-worn camera from Officer 1 and we received the 3-minute video of Officer 1 in her patrol vehicle prior to exiting and responding to the 911 call, and that was all that she had. She did not turn on her body-worn camera. And so after review of all the evidence, I concluded that the allegations of deficient performance of duties and failure to provide medical attention against both Officer 1 and Officer 2 were not sustained. And against Officer 1, who was in violation of the adherence to rules by way of not activating her body-worn camera, is sustained. And so in this instance, I recommended a 2-day suspension for the non-activation of her body-worn camera, and she did have a disciplinary in her file, an oral reprimand for negligent care in government property after misplacing her body-worn camera. And so that concludes CC 2022-043.
Discussion on the executive director's report and recommendation. Board Member Goddard.
Very quickly, I think this is less egregious than the one we just gave 1 day to. I would give a written reprimand, which is still a serious thing, and it stays in the file consequence for this. That's what I would, but again, I don't want to move yet, but just have discussion. That's what I'd recommend.
I'd like to add to this that Officer 2, after this, we're not really sure exactly, but was it a few days later, she resigned from the department. So she is no longer employed with MMPD.
And she was the officer who,
Officer,
I'm sorry, I still missed which officer resigned.
discussion. I see Board Member Holloway.
I'm hearing one thing, but I'm reading another thing. They were saying that they did not provide medical attention. But they did, what I did hear when you reading that they did show where they did assist in trying to get her medical attention, which they were doing their job. So I don't agree with the statement about they didn't provide medical attention. I just, because they did take steps while they tried to provide, assist her in getting medical attention.
And I agree with you, and that's why that was an unfounded allegation. Okay. So we're here at this issue then of the deactivation or non-activation of the body-worn camera with an officer who is no longer with the force? Okay. But the recommendations, still valid recommendation that gets sent over to MMPD for the file. I see Board Member Goddard.
I'll go ahead and move that it be accepted with modification to written reprimand. And I appreciate that either option is not going to have a real world consequence, but to sort of build a record on where we think these failure to turn on body worn cameras start on this first offense. That's what I would move.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
It was a motion.
Okay. It's been moved and properly seconded that we modify the recommendation to a written warning or
A written reprimand.
a written reprimand for the offense related to the body worn camera. Is there further discussion? Hearing, I see two. I see first of all, Board Member Brown.
I'm kind of halfway between Member Goddard's and the directors. It seems to me like the importance of body-worn cameras needs to be reinforced, and if there was some explanation for why the officer one didn't turn on her camera, then it was an explanation, at least I would go with a reprimand, but it seems to me that a one-day suspension, when the camera's not on, there's no real basis for not turning it on, and we ought to stick with at least a day suspension. So I would disagree with the reprimand. I would go with a one-day suspension.
And there was a previous incident associated with body worn.
That she,
Misplaced.
wasn't taking care, she misplaced her body.
Okay, all right. I saw Board Member McCree.
Yes, I did have a question for you, Director. Not that it changes my vote, but was the decision to leave the force a part of this case? Was that ever stated?
It wasn't stated. She did leave the force, I think it was 2 days after the interview.
Okay.
So I'm not really sure if it was already pre-planned or if this was, that part wasn't relayed to us.
Thank you.
There's a motion on the floor, and just to be clear, that the recommended suspension be reduced to a written reprimand. Any further discussion on that motion before we call for the vote on that motion? All right, all in favor of that motion to reduce it to a written reprimand, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no.
No.
All right, that motion fails. That takes us back to the original recommendation. Is there a recommendation on the original motion? I see Board Member Brown.
I recommend that it be changed to a one-day suspension.
Oh, that it remain. Oh, no, it's a two. Okay, a 1 day. Okay.
Yeah, the recommendation's two.
I got
recommend
you.
it be changed to one.
Is there a second?
A second.
All right, it's been moved and properly seconded that the recommendation from staff for a 2-day suspension be modified to a 1-day suspension. Is there any discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Opposed, say no. Motion carries.
All right, the next PRR is MNCO complaint CC 2022-048. The allegations of misconduct are against Officer 1, discourtesy and lack of professionalism; against Officer 2, the deficient performance of duty. The complainant filed a complaint stating that earlier that evening on September the 7th of 2022, the complainant had called MMPD to report a man in her neighbor's yard acting suspiciously. The Officer 1 responded to the complainant, alleged that she was rude. Specifically, the complainant reported that Officer 1 said to her, "I'm wearing a body camera. If you're going to ask what I think you're going to ask," in a way that the complainant found rude and dismissive. A second Officer 2 came up and allegedly told the complainant that the complainant was under investigation for harassment instead of investigating the complainant's report. That was her allegations. And the findings of fact is on September the 7th, at 2022 at about 10:08 p.m., The complainant called the emergency ECC and reported that in her backyard watering, there was some dude peeping in the windows. The complainant further alleged that her neighbor had asked a man, "Who are you and what are you doing?" and the man did not answer. The complainant gave her neighbor's address to the ECC. When asked by the ECC where the complainant was calling from, because that's where the police would be dispatched, the complainant responded, "You can send them to my address as long as it's not too late because I'll be in bed." On this 4-minute, 23-second phone call to ECC, the complainant mentioned the person was looking through the windows of houses with a flashlight. She said that seven times. On Officer One's body camera at approximately 10:09 p.m., the MNCO observed Officer One ringing the bell on the complainant's door. Officer Two arrived separately and spoke with the neighbor during Officer One's initial contact with the complainant. Upon the complainant answering the door, Officer One stated, "Hi, how are you? I'm Officer such and such. I have a body camera. Everything is being audio and video recorded." The complainant responded, "That's fine." Officer One asked, "You called in a suspicious person." The complainant spoke for about 1 minute and 42 seconds without interruption. At approximately 10:12, Officer One interrupted to ask, "Whose property is this suspicious person on, at what house?" About 30 seconds later, Officer One asks again, "Where? What is the address?" At 10:13 p.m., Officer One asked to see the video that the complainant referenced. Apart from that, the complainant spoke virtually uninterrupted for about 7 minutes. During her interaction with Officer One, the complainant made no mention of the suspicious person peering through windows. Instead, it was alleged the person was approaching the fence of their own backyard with a flashlight. The complainant stated that her neighbor had asked the person, "Who are you and what are you doing?" on a different night. When Officer One informed the complainant that a crime hadn't been alleged and no further action would be taken, the complainant brought up a prior instance involving dogs barking and asked about the charge of stalking. At 10:14 p.m., Officer Two concluded his conversation with the neighbor, and at 10:16 p.m., Officer Two approached the complainant and Officer One during their conversation. Officer Two informed the complainant that the neighbor has asked for a harassment complaint against the complainant and that this would make it the 4th time a report had been made against the complainant. The complainant stated multiple times that she believed the person's behavior was creepy. Officer One stated multiple times to the complainant that standing in their own backyard with a flashlight is not illegal. And then, of course, there's this exchange. Officer One says, "I'm going to do some extra patrols. Try to avoid the neighbors. I understand you think it's creepy, but it's not against the law." The complainant says, "If they're setting off the lights in the backyard and they're just standing there," Officer One says it's not illegal if they're in their own yard. Officer Two, "They can do that all night." Complainant, "Well, I guess I can too. The fact of the matter is, don't antagonize. What is this?" And this exchange goes on and on about barking dogs and other things like that. So at approximately 10:09 p.m., Officer Two arrived and spoke with the neighbor who requested that she wanted to file another report of harassing behavior against the complainant. And so it seems like this is a neighbor's dispute, but anyway. A review of both the body-worn camera video from Officer One and Officer Two demonstrate that both officers displayed professional, courteous, and patient behavior with the complainant at all times. The complainant was given ample time to tell the officers her allegations against a neighbor, and the complainant spoke for several minutes, virtually uninterrupted, except for the officers to ask clarifying questions. At no point did Officer One say, "I'm wearing a body-worn camera if you're going to ask what I think you're going to ask." Instead, at one point, Officer One interrupted to apparently caution the complainant against potentially making a threatening statement against a neighbor. Officer Two arrived at the scene, interviewed the neighbor, and went to assist Officer One with her interview of the complainant. Officer Two then informed the complainant of the neighbor's harassment complaint as a matter of record. His behavior and actions were consistent with policy regarding preliminary investigations. And so after review of all the evidence, I conclude that the allegations of discourtesy and lack of professionalism against Officer One and allegation of deficient performance of duties against Officer Two are unfounded. And that concludes CC 2022-048.
You've heard the report, the recommendation. Is there any discussion on the report? I see Board Member Brown. Okay, you want to make that a form of a motion, or, okay, so it's been moved that no, but we need to move it to discuss it. So, okay, there's a motion on the floor from Board Member Brown,
A second.
and there's a second, further discussion. All right, board member, please go forward.
McCree, okay.
Michaela McCree.
Yes, so clarifying question, the body camera is on. The, folks involved are just not made aware that the body camera is on, is that correct?
The body cameras are on, I didn't hear your second part.
The body cameras are on, but the folks involved have not been made aware that the body cameras are on.
No, she was made aware that the body worn camera is on.
Gotcha.
These sound like, some tough situations where these type of neighbor disputes occur, and cooler heads certainly prevailed here, it sounds like. And they can be quite dangerous as well. Let us now dispose of this issue at the will of this board. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, let it be known by the sign aye. All in favor of the recommendation?
Aye.
All opposed, say no. Motion carries. Before we move away from that, I think that this is one of the instances where our police officers, actually contribute to de-escalation and also perform, in certain ways, kind of above and beyond in certain situations. And I know each member of this board has the authority to recommend a commendation. We're always focusing on the recommended discipline, but we also have the opportunity to recommend accommodation, and I'd like to direct staff to prepare accommodation from the chair to Officer 1. Under my signature, please. All right. With that, I know that we actually anything further?
I had one, not on this.
Okay.
Not on this case. I did want to ask, do we know whether this board will be reviewing the Covenant school shooting event?
Director Fitcher, we are coming back to your report, and I assume that would be that's quite all right. We have business prior to going back. I do not believe so. So we'll go back to Director Fitcher's report, and if you can hit us with some of the many highlights that we need to be aware of, please do so. The floor is yours.
Okay, sure. Of course, I've had to update this since I sent this out. So there are some things in here that you possibly didn't get, but I'll read them today. Where am I? Board meetings. Okay. We had our executive committee meeting on Monday, March the 20th. The next board meeting will be held Monday, April the 24th. We are moving our meetings back into the community. This next one will be, and I'll send you all that information, it will be located at the Madison Branch Library. It is from 4 to 6 p.m. That was the only times they had available. So that would be in Madison, Tennessee I see you looking at me, Mr. Holloway. That will be on Gallatin Road. Okay, so I'll send you all that information. I did check in with the mayor's office in regards to the board appointment and the liaison. And I inquired about the vacancy left by member Hildreth, and asked if they had identified a permanent COB liaison. I was told that Tom Jerkovich is our liaison. He'll continue to serve as the liaison. And the mayor had not made a selection to fill the vacancy yet, but will continue to seek out candidates. And because of the pending legislation and its uncertainty, that had given them some pause on how to proceed. So that was the last thing I heard on that. We did have the next topic is the budget. We met on the 29th for the budget modification and improvement. We met with the mayor's performance management team, and Mr. Milliner was able to sit in on that call. I think it went well. It was about an hour long. They asked a lot of questions, and they've asked follow-up questions. I've sent that information to them as well. I want to talk about two shootings or two call-outs for that. The first one, I'm going to move right into that. The first one, I received a call on Friday, March the 24th at 5:33 p.m. From Commander Carlos Lara, who's here with us, regarding a fatal police shooting that occurred in the nation's area of West Nashville. He stated that the descendant was alleged to have shot his girlfriend's mother in the chest in the front yard of a home in the area, and then possibly shot another person in the leg. The shooting was reported to be domestic in nature, and the decedent had left the scene where the shootings occurred. Assistant Director Kylie and our investigator Williams arrived on the scene and was briefed about the incident by Metro Police officials. It was reported that the decedent had placed a weapon under his chin area when confronted by Officer Michael Honeycutt, and that the decedent fired his weapon one time, fatally wounding himself in the head area. Assistant Director Kylie was advised that the involved MMPD officer fired his weapon as well, but did not strike the decedent. And the decedent was rendered aid by officers on the scene and subsequently died of his injuries. The TBI investigators were on the scene, and once finished with the collection of the evidence, escorted Kylie and Williams through the scene. Kylie and Williams reported to MMPD headquarters to view the unredacted body-worn and in-car camera video footage. The video showed the decedent holding what appeared to be a small gun. The type was not identified at the time of viewing. And him placing the gun under his chin, pulling the trigger, and then falling to the ground. On Monday, March the 27th, the MNC investigator made a request for all of the records related to that and the video footage.
Before we move on, do we know if the officer fired before or after the decedent?
So at this point, the only thing that we've seen is the body cam and the dash cam, because the officer's vehicle was parked in the middle of the street, pretty much directly in front of where this happened. It's pretty clear from the video that the gentleman fires on himself first. It appears that Officer Honeycutt sort of fires possibly as a reflex action to the noise or something like that. But I think it's clear from the body cam that the gentleman fired under his chin first, and then the officer fired. So I don't think there's much question there.
Thank you.
And I don't think that the officers, when he fires, that it doesn't strike the decedent.
It did not appear to strike him at all. There was a small burst of dust or dirt or something off to the side of him where it seems pretty clear that that's the officer's round hitting either the ground or a wall or something like that.
Okay. And so this is MMPD police shooting number 2. I received a notification from DEC regarding an active shooter at the Covenant School in Burton Hills. I received a call of 11:19 a.m. from Commander Lara, who shared whatever information he had at the time. He stated that a lone shooter had entered the school and shot several people. At the time of the call, he was unsure of how many people were shot or injured, but he stated the assailant was deceased. He stated that MMPD was assisting the paramedics with transporting individuals to ambulances to get them to the medical attention they needed, and they were setting up a reunification area for families to be reunited with their children. It was obvious by the tone in his voice and the background noise that many things were transpiring quickly. And I made the decision that the MNC investigations team would wait for more information and stay in place at the office until further notice. Commander Lara called me multiple times throughout the day to give me updates. He called at 2:52 p.m., he called again at 7:27 p.m., and then he called me the following day. And so he told me how we could get the body-worn camera footage. I told him exactly what we needed, some things I didn't think that we needed. And so that information was requested. I did want to read something that came out today, just to give you guys information if you didn't have it in relation to the shooting. It says, this was a media release that was released today. It says, the ongoing investigation into the March 27th murders of 6 persons inside the Covenant School continues to show, from all information currently available, that the killer acted totally alone. In the collective writings by Ms. Hale, found in her vehicle in the school parking lot, and others later found in the bedroom of her home, she documented in journals her planning over a period of months to commit mass murder at the Covenant School. The writings remain under careful review by MPD and the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico, Virginia. The motive for the actions have not been established and remains under investigation by the Homicide Unit in consultation with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. It is not known that Hale considered the actions of other mass murderers. The investigation shows that Hale fired a total of 152 rounds. 126 of those were from rifle rounds and 26 from 9mm rounds. From the time she shot her way into the school until she was killed by police. 2 officers fired on Hale. Officer Rex Engelbert discharged a total of 4 rifle rounds from his rifle, and Officer Michael Colazzo discharged a total of 4 rounds from his department-issue 9mm pistol. It says scores of police personnel from number of components responded to the Covenant call last Monday. The department's professional wellness section is conducting critical incident debriefings, including daily wellness checks for involved personnel. The MPD's homicide unit is leading the investigation into the murders of the 6 victims. The cold case unit is working with the TBI in the investigation of the fatal police shooting. And that's all I have.
On that issue, I just want to reiterate that that was the cause for the postponement of our board meeting last week, in deference and out of respect for that senseless tragedy. I know some board members may have some comments to offer, and now is the time. The floor is open. Board Member Nguyen, did you have something?
Yeah, Chair, I want to be careful not to say too much about this without influencing the staff or the investigators who might look at the case. Is that this case will be reviewed?
Yes.
There's a lot I'd like to say, but I need to be very careful, be proper about my comments. So I'll save my evaluation for after the case has been clearly looked at and investigated by the board. So, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone? Okay, I see Board Member McCree and Board Member Goddard, Board Member McCree, and Board Member Holloway. Board Member McCree.
Okay. So first, I will say that thank you for acknowledging this and moving back the meeting. Tennesseans all over the state this week, it was a rough week. Mm-hmm. We lost 6 folks, 3 of those being babies. And while I know this will be a case we will need to review, I want to publicly, as loud as we are about when things go wrong, we criticize them, and rightfully so. If I can, I want to publicly thank the 5 officers who went into that school and the 2 officers who quickly stopped the active shooter. I want to do that publicly. The next thing I will say is that citizens all over this state and law enforcement have been vocal about the regressive gun laws in this state that put our officers at risk, that put our babies at risk, and that make our communities less safe. As we speak, hundreds, if not more than 1,000 folks across Tennessee gather at our Capitol to speak against this right now. And regardless of where you fall on the issue, what we know today is that 6 folks are dead, 6 Tennesseans are dead, and that more folks continue to die when we let guns be easily accessed in our state. And so I will say that if we are standing with citizens, if we are standing with officers, now is the time to listen. I will say that this is not the time to silence the voice of citizens, and that being by the legislation that seeks to directly aimed at this board. That is realistically, if we're being honest, that legislation will pass. So, yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that if you're listening to this board, if you want safer communities, if you respect the work that we do here, speak up, get involved, call your legislators, and call in support of this board and the work we do and your children and our communities. Now is the time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Board Member McCree. I saw Board Member Holloway.
First of all, I'd just like to say, and I've always said that we have some of the best training in the world. And I've always said I will put our training against any police department across the country. But this incident itself, it hurt a lot of people, whether you're Democrat, Republican, or Independent. And the kids are crying out, asking you to do something about the law to make it difficult getting these assault rifles, increase the penalty on it. And they've been out to the legislator, and I realized, I looking at some of these kids, some of them are getting close to voting age, and they're gonna remember you. Now, if you don't do something about it, they're gonna do something themselves. They're gonna vote you out of office.
Board Member Goddard.
Very quickly, I can't speak with the eloquence of Member McCree or the experience of a former police officer, current police officer, I guess. But I would add just this. These were not SWAT specially trained officers. These were line officers. They had received the normal training, and it was, from all we know at this point, don't want to confine the investigation, spectacular. And that's a compliment to the force from the top all the way down. It would be remiss not to say that for me. Thank you.
Board Member Holloway.
Just one more comment I'm through. That training itself saved my life. That's what you know there.
Well, considering that other board members have driven in this lane a little bit, I have to tell you, I agree with Board Member Holloway, and I agree with Chief Drake that we never wanted this to happen, ever, but I can promise you that there's been thousands and thousands and thousands of hours trained for this very moment when it did happen by generations of officers, not just the one that did this unbelievable rescue of this school. And I'll say this, that because I work for the IACP often, I'm connected with law enforcement nationwide. I can tell you that the conversations around the country are that the performance of the Metro Police at the Covenant School actually has bolstered law enforcement nationwide, because the last time we had an incident like this was in Uvalde, Texas. And there were almost 300 police officers on the site of that shooting that day. And they waited, I think, 77 minutes to make an entry to go into the school. And it's suspected that some of the children bled to death before the paramedics could get to them because of some, well, I'll just say it, cowardice of some of the officers who ran that operation that day. So there is a conversation going that Nashville has now set the standard for the country. So I'm proud of that.
Anything further on the Covenant School shooting? Director Fisher?
And although I am going, we're going to investigate it, I did want to say that, you know, what I saw in the response from the officers, I thought was extraordinary. I will say that this is the time to lift up those families. Some of them have not buried their children or the adults. And so I think it's appropriate for us to take a moment of silence for those who are suffering through this. Not only the people who are completely involved with the loss, but also the people in the area, in our city and in our nation, in our state. And so I'd like to do that if it's proper.
Absolutely. And before we do that, to round off the discussion, did you have something, Board Member Haddock? And then we'll go into a moment of silence.
This was incredibly personal for me. Just because I have a school-age child. And so when things like this happen, you hope that we don't have another Robb Elementary, right, in Uvalde. And you think that the officers are just doing their job, but you can't help but to describe it as heroic. Because even though we lost 6 people, or 7, it could have been many more.
Yeah.
And so it is about common sense gun laws. It's about assault weapons being on the street and in the hands of mentally ill folk. It is, you know, all of these issues. But then it's also about, you know, making sure that this board is here to be objective and to not only focus on the misconduct of officers, but making sure that where praise is given where praise is due. And so that's something to be proud of. But then also, as we continue to look at Covenant and, you know, school shootings, because the reality of it is that this may not be the last one. And so how do we move forward? But how do we move forward in a cohesive way where no matter where you fall on it, that we put our kids first?
Board Member Woodson.
I was inspired by the words of my fellow board members, and I just wanted to share an experience that I had. Part of the work that I do is in schools, and I was actually at a school teaching poetry the day that last Monday when it all happened, but it brought me back to a couple of years ago. I was at a high school and there was a rumor that there was an active shooter on the grounds. And so we had to take all the precautions, and I just remember being a guest in the school, but being one of 2 adults, in addition to the teacher, in the classroom, and us having to get down on the floor. And I remember how scared I was as an adult, and I could not imagine being a child and just looking at their faces. And the fear. When I was a kid, we were doing tornado drills and earthquake drills, and if there's a fire, stop, drop, and roll. I had never been in a situation where I'm trapped in a classroom, and even though it was just a rumor, fortunately, at the time we didn't know that. We thought that that we could be faced with someone with a gun, and so it just brought hearing about what happened on Monday. It brought me back to that moment because I could see the faces of the young people that I was with years back, and I understood the fear firsthand because I experienced it myself. And I'm just telling that story because I want to just, further lift up all the comments that were made by my board members and say that there is something that we have to do to stop this because our lives are on the line, our children's lives are on the line. So thank you for letting me share.
Any other comments? I see, Board Member Brown.
I think I'm the last of the Mohicans to speak. And, you know, it's all a moment of sadness, and I think what disturbs us all is that in all likelihood, this is not the last incident we're gonna see. And I've been involved with marksmanship all my life. I've got the highest award for military marksmanship, for high-power rifle. And I wrote my law review article back in 1965 on firearms control. And the problem is we seem to have ignored the first part of the Second Amendment, which is a well-regulated militia. We just seem to have cut that totally out of everything, and, you know, I hope at some point maybe the Supreme Court will read that back into the regulation, but I just hope the legislature will take some action to, obviously you can't prohibit everybody from having a firearm. I think that is constitutional, but to have some bearing to a well-regulated militia and to have, you know, now we have, quote, constitutional carry, which basically seems to allow anybody to carry a gun with no training at all, which I've written the governor about it and didn't get much of a response, didn't get any response, of course, but hopefully the legislature and Congress are gonna take a look at and have some reasonable regulation. And we can add more resource officers. We can do some other things, but we've got to somehow get some regulation, reasonable regulation, and, you know, red flag laws. And one of the things that's been reported in this case that, you know, the individual that was responsible for this was under some care, and to whether that should have been reported and whether that could have been a red flag to take away the weapons, or things that I'm sure are going to be going into over the years. But hopefully we just need to take a look and realize the risk of firearms and that we have reasonable regulation. So that's my 2 cents worth. And it's sort of like, I think, unfortunately, standing in front of a freight train.
Thank you. Thank you all for those words. Let us have a moment of silence for the victims of the Covenant School shooting. Thank you very much. Director, please continue.
All right, myself and AD Kylie attended a forest review hearing on March the 23rd. Another one is scheduled on April the 27th, and we both will attend that. There has been 6 investigative complaints since our last board meeting in February, 3 director-initiated investigations, a total of 61 non-complaint and contact calls for service. That includes the social work contacts, as well as 4 dispositions related to officer misconduct since our last board meeting. The investigators also requested 8 police records, and they did report having longer delays. I got a call from Commander Brian Williams last Friday evening, in regards to the records. He wanted to discuss the delay in records, talk about a spreadsheet that he was creating for us. And wanted to use that as a tracking tool so that they could kind of have a understanding, of how the records are being requested and where the delays are happening, which I thought was a great idea. He and I have talked multiple times, and he has asked that myself and AD Kylie come out to the records division. He wanted us to look at in their process and tour the division, so that we can have an understanding about how these records request and, where they go and how they, how they are, distributed to the others, in the agency. So we said we'd probably go out there either Wednesday or Thursday, to see how that operation is. I just wanted to let you know that we did interview individuals for the open investigator position, and AD Kylie, and I extended an offer to a candidate. The administrative service manager position is under review, and I think we had 14 people apply for that, 14 people that were qualified. So we'll start that process this week. And I wanted to say that we are having a staff retreat in April the 21st. This is April, on the 21st. But I also wanted to have a board member retreat. And I'd like to do that in June. So maybe, if you guys can let me know whether a Friday would work for you or a Saturday. And I would like to do a whole day of different trainings and things of that nature, but if 4 hours works, that's fine with us. So just let me know what works best for you all. I'll send you out some information on that, and see, what kind of, there's different type of trainings that we have out and available. So, we can talk a little bit more about that. I think basically you saw the community outreach. We are still planning to have our community day. That is going to be on May the 20th at the Magruder Family Resource Center. A lot of people are interested in that and have partnered with us, so we're looking forward to that. And we still have lots of research going on. You guys are familiar with that. As for the office space, the last update was that the General Service Assistant Director said that they were still doing negotiations with a new location that we had looked at. It's 44 Vantage Way. It's in Metro Center. So they are still working on that location, trying to get the negotiation of the lease agreements together for our agency, as well as MCC, which is Metro Action Commission, and Social Services. And so those talks are moving forward. A little bit about legislation. The Nashville community, they continue to call us and email their support of the work of the board and this staff. Community members stated they voted for the Oversight Board. They want to keep the hybrid model that the Nashville currently has in place because it ensures the independence of investigations into claims of misconduct. On Wednesday, March the 29th, 2023, the Senate and State and Local Government Committee voted to move the bill forward to the House Criminal Justice Committee. It'll be heard on tomorrow, April the 4th at 12:30 p.m. I did speak on March the 29th. I appreciate Board Member Haddock and all the rest of the members of the staff that went there and members of the public. I just wanted to let you know when the next hearing would be. I also wanted to tell you that we have received commendations for the Covenant shooting, where people from the public have sent in commendations for the officers in expressing their appreciation for officers of our police department and how they handled that. Some for individual officers, as well as some for just the whole department collectively. And so we greatly appreciate receiving those as well. That concludes my executive director's report, and I'll take any questions.
Questions for the executive director on the report. I see Board Member Goddard.
No questions, just a couple of comments. First, I watched the video of the hearing of the bill. They save those. You can watch them later if you want to. The committee limited Director Fisher to 3 minutes. I thought she did an extraordinary job of making numerous salient points within that strict time frame, which they very much enforced. It was a straight party line vote, as I recall. The majority did not have ears to hear, but it wasn't for lack of good and compelling statements being made to them. So thank you very much for that. Second, unfortunately, I share Member McCree's lack of optimism about this bill being defeated or dying in committees. It's not a given, but it's likely to pass, I think. If it does, as I read it, barring something, I don't go to court or anything, we've got until it would be late September, 90 days after July 1, to continue any investigation of anything that occurred prior to July 1. So I don't have a set of priorities for you, but I would encourage Executive Director Fitchard and staff to look at what we've got out there in terms of complaints and work in process and figure out what is important, what could have an effect, what could have statements we need to make, and bring as many of those to this board as you can by the last meeting we have in September, I suppose. Thank you very much.
Other comments? All right. I'd also like to acknowledge, I'm sorry, please, board member.
Yeah, I agree, Board Member Goddard. Director Fisher did an extraordinary job stating the case for the Metro Community Oversight Board that the people voted for. And it was astonishing to see the party line vote and the comments that were spoken publicly about the Community Oversight Board. And I still feel like that there is work to be done, a lot of work to be done, no matter what the vote is. So just wanted to be on record that I'm a proud member of the Community Oversight Board and will be.
Director Fitchard.
This is a little, I wanted to acknowledge Commander Lara because, and I know this is a little bit off topic, but I wanted to thank you for calling us on that day. I know that you were under a lot of pressure to do the work that you were doing and you were called to do. I just wanted to let you know I appreciate it. I appreciated you talking to me, taking the time out of your schedule to think about, what we had going on. And I appreciate you and the work that you're doing for us.
Yeah, I just like the way the staff has continued to methodically and professionally show up and to show up with a precise agenda and to execute that agenda. And I want to encourage you to continue the good fight. I certainly intend to as much as we possibly can. I'm going to hold out as being the eternal optimist and also as one who by experience knows that anything could happen. And carry on and carry forward until the last, as we say in chess, until the last move. Okay, so I thank you all very much for your diligence. Having conducted the business of the Community Oversight Board, is there anything further, any new business? Hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn? We are adjourned.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.